Folks, welcome back to the Anchored Podcast, the official podcast of the Classic Learning Test. We have with us today a true intellectual heavyweight, Dr. Austin Stevenson, from one of our closest partner colleges, Palm Beach Atlantic University. Dr. Stevenson, before coming to PBA, was a junior research fellow at the University of Oxford, where he studied Christian vaccine hesitancy in collaboration with the Oxford Vaccine Group and the Vaccine Knowledge Project. He has taught theology at Oxford, Cambridge, London School of Theology, the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion at Ridley Hall. Dr. Stevenson studied music in college and served in full-time ministry as a worship pastor for 5 years before pursuing graduate education in theology. He's passionate about theological education, bridging the gap between systematic theology and biblical scholarship, and reclaiming the riches of Christian tradition for contemporary theological reflection. His research specializes in the ressourcement of classical Christian thought in conversation with an interdisciplinary range of topics. He is the author of The Consciousness of the Historical Jesus, Historiography, Theology, and Metaphysics. He has published articles and edited special issues of peer-reviewed journals, including Modern Theology, Scottish Journal of Theology, Journal of Theological Interpretation, the Journal of Religion and Science. Austin, Dr. Stevenson, great to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I always love, especially someone who has pursued the life of the mind so much at the most prestigious institutions in the world, Oxford, Cambridge, where you have taught as well. I want to know what your parents did right, when you were growing up. Did you always have a deep love for learning, or did that develop later in life?
I think that I always had a kind of secret love for learning, but it certainly didn't develop very much until much later in life. I grew up in Wyoming. I would say my family, didn't care that much about the life of the mind. We read kind of popular fiction a lot. John Grisham was my favorite author as probably too young of a child. So I always loved reading, that kind of thing. But I always had a hard time seeing school as anything more than a sort of barrier to the stuff I wanted to be doing.
Public school, Christian school, homeschool?
I went to a private Christian school for grade school and then public school for middle school and high school.
Where in Wyoming? It's not every day you hear folks say they grew up in Wyoming.
Yeah, so I grew up in Cheyenne, the capital, about 2 hours north of Denver, Colorado. And it was, so growing up, it was, I did construction with my dad and very much kind of outside the world of any academic things. And so, I went to college to study music. And again, most of the academic stuff outside of music, I just felt was a kind of barrier that I had to get through. But I was always good at that stuff. But, so high school me would have, pretended not to know the answers to things, that kind of student, but would secretly get good grades. And so it really wasn't until late in university when I took some classes in philosophy and theology. And I thought this
is as an undergrad?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it was really college that I thought, actually, I really care about a lot of this stuff and I love it. And I want to take it seriously. So that I think I'm quite late in terms of when I discovered, my sort of academic interests.
Okay. And then these kind of three, the life of the mind, your deep love for music and, your Christian life. Was it about the same time that these things kind of came together, or were these compartmentalized growing up? How did they come together?
Yeah, I think they were compartmentalized. I think, the form of kind of evangelical Christianity that I grew up in was heavy on emotion and really light on intellect. I think I always thought, having a sort of knowing God happens through feeling and not thinking. A lot of sermons about even faith as the sort of undoing of reason or the opposite of reason. And if you think too much, you'll lose your faith, that kind of thing. And so so I think it was in college where I discovered that, my mind might play a role in my sort of faith and then music. Yeah, I think it was also in some ways for me, unfortunately, I think the move towards doing academic stuff was a move away from doing music. But obviously that doesn't have to be the case.
Well, was there a moment where you first thought, I could see myself as a professor. I could see myself in academia.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly probably senior year of college. I was I was a worship pastor and realizing that that's not what I wanted to do with my life. And it was funny in college, the only students at the university that I went to that had to write a senior thesis were music students, which is probably abnormal. So I had to write a thesis. It was supposed to be about music, but I convinced them to let me write it about Karl Barth. And his theology,
Oh,
and I really enjoyed that. It was a great process. And the professors I was working with were like, "Have you thought about going to grad school?" And I was like, honestly, I barely know what grad school is. Um, but they were like, well, you seem to be quite good at this. You might enjoy it. You could be a professor. So that was the first time I had ever even thought about it, but it very quickly captured my imagination as far as a possible life path.
okay. Okay. Where was your undergrad?
Colorado Christian University in Denver.
Yeah, great CLT partner college. Love Colorado Christian. And then before you get to Oxford, Cambridge, did you do graduate work in the U.S.?
In Canada, I was at in Vancouver at Regent College.
Oh, was Packer still alive and well at that
He
point?
was, yeah, he was still teaching well into his 90s. Uh,
Incredible. Incredible. So, sure, many listeners of the Anchor podcast were influenced by the work of J.I. Packer. I know I certainly was myself. I think Oxford, Cambridge, they loom so large in the imagination. So many folks within the classical renewal movement. Just the beauty of campuses, the campuses, the history, the Inklings, all of it, right? Yeah, and for many, it's just an unrealized dream. But you got to live the dream. So tell us about that, and how did it shape who you are today?
Yeah, it was. It really was a dream. I think, and I often was, something of an odd one out given my background at a place like Oxford and Cambridge. Most of the students were sort of Ivy League trained or something like that. But yeah, so a big part of how I got there would be Regent College. They send a lot of students to Oxford and Cambridge. It's just a really, really excellent kind of graduate theological school, and yeah, so I think it was such an interesting experience because it's a completely different world, right? And even applying to a place like Cambridge, I was like, I don't know what the colleges are. You're supposed to pick a college. All these kinds of things were so foreign to me. But it really was a dream, as soon as I arrived, I was like, this is like Disneyland for academics. Like,
Okay. I
this,
love that. Oxford is Disneyland for academics.
yeah, like these places, the library has every book that has ever gotten a copyright. You
Yeah.
have all of everyone you're reading is coming through to give talks and lectures, and you get to meet them in person. You're constantly sitting around tables or, having sort of hors d'oeuvres at events with other academics in, all kinds of different fields. And the system is very much trained to sort of teach you to engage with people in all the different disciplines and converse, about scholarship and stuff. And I came alive. I just felt like this is a world that I absolutely adore, and had such a wonderful time. And it was very rigorous, quite intense. A PhD at Cambridge is here's the library, write your dissertation. And so, the U.S. system has a lot more kind of direction and help along the way. But I just loved that. I really, really enjoyed it.
And tell us about that. What was your dissertation on?
So the dissertation has turned into what my first book is that you mentioned. But essentially, the project I was interested in was thinking about the development of critical historical methods in the modern period, the philosophical assumptions that are sort of baked into those methods, and then how those methods have impacted what it means to think about Jesus as a historical figure. And so engaging with kind of historical Jesus scholarship with a critical lens to how much of their kind of conclusions are coming from assumptions baked into the methods already, and how might sort of different philosophical assumptions lead us to do history differently. So trying to sort of bridge some gaps between theology and biblical scholarship, and sort of Christian doctrine and what some critical history might say.
Okay. And then tell us about the move from the UK to Palm Beach, Florida. If you've ever been to Palm Beach Atlantic University, my experience, my first thought when I saw it is like, this cannot be this is like a resort. This cannot be a university. It's right there in the it's insane. It's ridiculous. I know it's a very popular destination for CLT test takers. Of course, the Honors College is very well known, where you teach as well. But had you already known about PBA? How did you discover it?
Yeah, so actually, my best friend in Cambridge was hired to teach New Testament at PBA. And then we were looking to maybe come back to the States. I actually left my job at Oxford early, and my friend was like, "Well, we're hiring a theologian," and so that was sort of how we knew about it. He had studied here; he was an alumni, and so we had sort of talked about it at times. So that was the kind of personal connection that got me to apply. And yeah, and just seeing, the level of scholars that were teaching at PBA, the kind of work that was being done both in the School of Ministry, and the fact that our honors program has, such an excellent curriculum in history. And it is beautiful. I mean, growing up in Wyoming, one of my ultimate dreams was to live near the beach, because Wyoming's about as far away from the ocean as you can get. And so we had lived for a little while in Vancouver. We lived somewhere near the ocean, but it was always kind of a dream. And yeah, PBA is right on the ocean. It's really gorgeous. So yeah, so that was sort of the move. It was, it's quite a change from Oxford. South Florida is very different from England in basically every way. But yeah, it's beautiful here.
I want to try to formulate this question in a way that makes sense. But my take as just a layman is that, especially the later half of the 20th century, early 2000s, that there was kind of an option facing parents and students, that you could have kind of your Christian light university college experience that may have like some serious academics, or you could have your very faithful Christian college experience, but it may be light in academics. And my take is that is beginning in a big way to change, where you got so many institutions now. I could name many of these, and many of these very close CLT partner colleges that are both serious about their Christian identity, but like serious in terms of academic excellence as well. And that now, it used to be this kind of hard thing to find, is my take. And now places like the Honors College at Palm Beach Atlantic are leading this with, intellectual giants like yourself, where students can come and be taught by top faculty, but in a way that affirms and encourages their faith rather than undermines it. I wonder if you can speak into that. Is something substantive changing in higher ed, in Christian higher ed, in that way?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. If you think about the history of particularly American Christianity in the 20th century, maybe think about Mark Noll's book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. We had a period of time where evangelicals and Christians, more conservative Christians especially, were sort of worried about what was being taught in universities, and so often didn't pursue academic pursuits that much. And so you had academic institutions where the kind of committed Christians hadn't actually done that much in academia. They had sort of shied away from academic centers. And so the more robust kind of Christian experience often didn't have this sort of intellectual side. But there has been, a few generations of us Christians who have partly, I read Mark Noll as an undergrad and thought, oh, wow, this seems like was something we could do about this. And so there's a lot of us who then went and reached the very top levels of academia and, the sort of leading institutions around the world. And what that allowed us to do, I think, is to realize that, the highest level of academic pursuits are completely compatible with our beliefs as Christians, which shouldn't be surprising because, Christians are involved in founding the idea of the university in the first place, and, the history of Western thought. And so I think reclaiming ways of doing that, doing very high level work in our disciplines to think about the relationship between sort of faith commitments and how these disciplines work in really robust ways, rather, not just assuming that there's incompatibility here, or, it might be awkward, but really pushing in and finding, ways to bring these things together well. And then we've come back to these kinds of institutions. As a theologian, I think it's interesting, if you're going to teach theology, you're probably either at, an elite university that has a theology department. You're not really at state schools. They don't have much of that. Or you're at a sort of Christian liberal arts university. And so we a lot of us from leading institutions are at places like PBA, where you can do really, really excellent work. And so I think that is a shift then that we're seeing in these kinds of places. is that we just have multiple generations of Christians who have said, let's sort of reclaim our academic identity and role and bring that back into the basis.
I love, I think one of the aspects of being deep in history is coming to a sense of what's peculiar or just odd about our own lived experience. And I was probably out of seminary before I really started to grapple with the reality that for most of the history of, the church for the past 2,000 years, for at least 1,500 years, Christians were the academic establishment. We were the intellectual authority. And that all changes, really in the early 20th century, maybe the late 19th century. But maybe in a few hundred years, that will be viewed as just a historical anomaly. And I wonder that because the center seems to have not been able to hold, right? And that by the estimation of most Americans, there is something deeply amiss in higher ed right now. In fact, the majority of Americans, I think this is Pew, are saying that it's a net negative higher ed overall on America. Now we have the outliers, the Hillsdales and the Grove Cities and the PBAs, and that are doing great work in terms of forming the next people in all the right ways. But, we're living through pretty seismic shifts in higher education, and even a lot of colleges and universities closing right now. Well, what do you think the next 10 or 20 years is going to bring in terms of further disruption and developments and changes in higher ed?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a little bit hard to tell because I think we're at a space where we can do something about what that's going to look like, but will we? I think is the question. For me, I think one of the biggest things that has happened has just been the fact that university has transformed into career credentialing. And I think that if it continues on that path, there's no real reason for universities. I think it makes more sense that big corporations are going to have their own training centers. And
that is a very honest statement. That is great,
Yeah, I think it's true. Universities aren't for that. It doesn't make any sense. And so the hollowing out of the humanities curricula and all of that so that you can have these professional degree programs, I think those are just going to replace everything at a university, and then it's not a university anymore. It's a tech school. And that might be where things go. And then we have to find alternative institutions to do the kind of work that universities do. But I think the question is, do we have the courage to double down on the fact that forming humans to live, to flourish is more important than credentialing so they can make money in a career that's going to change a bunch of times anyways, given our sort of economy.
I get the chills when I think of C.S. Lewis here. He says, if education is beaten by training, civilization dies. There's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake here.
There is, right? There absolutely is. And it's not just an institutional problem. Our students are taught from birth that they should only do stuff if they're getting a grade or they're getting credit or they're getting money. And so teaching them that, right, they are the product, that doing the work is forming them into a different kind of person is also a tough sell for a lot of students. And so, right, realizing that that's not what they're looking for when they're looking for a university because they don't know to look for it necessarily. That's not always what their parents are looking for. And so that's, I think the future of higher education is just gonna be a question of, which of those directions, and maybe there's a balance to be had there. But I think, from my perspective, whether Christians are going to be leading that, right, is going to be whether Christians are capable of creating spaces where people can do genuinely important work with a broad range of people for the purpose of what education is actually for, right? And that's in the past, that's why Christians were sort of leaders in academia. And so I think, that's sort of, I think it's very much up in the air right now in terms of where that's going to go in the next few decades.
I spent a lot of time touring K-12 classical Christian schools, Catholic schools, and when you walk the hall, especially this time of year, you'll typically find somewhere where you can see where the current seniors are heading. And some of these schools, it's so encouraging. You got so many of these schools now, they're sending tons of kids to places like PBA and Grove City and Hillsdale and these great schools. But some of them, it's surprising. Sometimes you'll see it's almost entirely, Ivies or big state schools or public universities. And I think there's this question that college counselors at classical schools are having with students and parents are having with faculty. And the students are trying to say, look, I've had a great K-12 education, at some of these top schools, Veritas School of Richmond, places. I was just at Trinitas in Pensacola, Florida, an incredible classical Christian school there. I mean, these young people are years ahead of their peers. I'm just blown away by them. But that question of and that itch of, I've experienced this kind of education, I want to go stand out at the University of Florida or Florida State, these big public institutions, where in some ways, like, we want these students to be the leaders at these big publics. What is your advice for parents, for college counselors, as they're trying to think through these big decisions about where to go to college?
Yeah, and it's not easy. There's so many questions, I think, that are involved. I will say, on the one hand, I personally really have thrived at, secular institutions as a sort of Christian. I find it, but that's in part because I was deeply formed by, Christian institutions that did education well. I think it is that question of balance. Who is the student? But also, and broader questions of, do they have a sort of community and tradition around them supporting what they're doing and where they're going? I think there's so much value in a place where they can do an integrated thing, right? So if a university is supposed to give us a sort of cohesive whole vision of the whole, places like PBA can do that. We sort of have a sense of how all of this fits together. And that's one of the challenges that you would face at sort of maybe a state school or an Ivy League, is the kind of fragmentation of knowledge and what do students do with that. There are many resources, I think, to help them deal with that well in those sorts of spaces. But it is the question not only of what kind of career do they want to do, right? Which I think is often, again, at the forefront of everyone's mind, is how's this going to position them for their career, but just the kind of life that they want to lead, right? And there are important questions to be asked about, certain paths that they want to go on. They're going to be really well served by going to like a Yale or something like that. But many of them, that's not fully necessary. I went to a Christian liberal arts university and was able to end up at Oxford and Cambridge because that's the trajectory I wanted to do. So you're certainly not limiting yourself by attending these sort of smaller liberal arts universities. So I mean, I don't think that there's an absolute answer one way or another. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for, in these formative years, thinking about the sort of formation of the whole person in these students, finding a space that's going to enable them to do that well, but also is going to have the resources for them to, pursue the kind of academic pursuits that they're serious about to the highest level.
Tell us about your book, The Consciousness of the Historical Jesus.
Yeah, it's it's based on my doctoral dissertation, expanded a decent amount from that. It works a lot with the thought of Thomas Aquinas, so that's a sort of area of specialty that I have, particularly sort of recovering his metaphysics, his understanding of ontology, for both thinking about Christ and thinking about sort of historical method. One of the big arguments in the book is that, for those who are familiar with historical Jesus scholarship, this is a field that really begins as a way of trying to take down Christian beliefs about Jesus and say, actually, historically, Jesus was somebody else, right? And that's shifted over the years, and there's a lot of different things going on in that field. But what I argue is essentially that one of the biggest differences between what Christians confess about Jesus and what historical Jesus scholars say isn't necessarily his divinity, but it's his humanity that they differ about. They have a different vision of what humans are. And so, Christians believe that Jesus was fully divine and fully human, but by fully human, they mean something different than what typically historical Jesus scholars mean by Jesus was fully human. So in the book, I deal with kind of theological anthropology, thinking about the nature of those kinds of questions, and then how that shapes what it means to do history. So when we're thinking about a historical figure, we're thinking about their self-understanding, their intentions with their characteristic actions, that sort of thing. And I think about how that would shift if we had something like Aquinas's understanding of reality and of humans, as opposed to what we get in this sort of 18th, 19th century German historicism. So that's basically the book.
It was one of my greatest surprises in seminary, the amount of time and I went to Reformed Theological Seminary, but the amount of time we focused on the changing view, especially in the 20th century, of of historical Jesus and the humanity. Exactly what you're saying. So very interested in that. Now, we always end the Anchored podcast asking your guest, what is the book that has influenced you the most? Maybe a book that you reread every year or recommend to students.
Well, yeah, there's so many, but the one that I find really, really helpful, and the one that I think, this was a book that I was assigned in grad school, and I sat down and I just read the whole thing straight through, and couldn't stop, and then it like changed so much for me. It's actually luckily right here, but Andrew Louth's book, Discerning the Mystery. It's an essay on the nature of theology. So Andrew Louth is a patristic scholar based in Cambridge, and this, he wrote this in, was it the 80s, I think? He's an Eastern Orthodox priest, but I think at the time he was Anglican. But it's an incredible text about the nature of theology, and essentially he's outlining people like Gadamer and a number of those thinkers, but he's thinking about the fact that in the modern period, historical method is about, right, if we have a method to get to objective facts, we should use that on things like the Bible or these broader questions. And he's thinking about the fact that for most of the history of Christianity, we feel like truth resides in subjectivity, in this sort of the engagement of a subject with something beyond them that transforms them. And that theology should be more in that realm, what we would call the humanities, than in this, the humanities aping the sciences using kind of scientific methods. So I think it does a remarkable job of sort of arguing for a patristic vision of the nature of truth and theology. And I use it a lot to help the students understand what's happening in pre-modern Christian thought, because it feels quite foreign to us often.
Fantastic. We're here with Dr. Austin Stephenson, professor in the Honors College at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Again, students, parents, if you've never been to PBA, it is a mind-blowing campus and one of the most solid colleges and honors college that we recommend here at CLT to our listeners. Dr. Stephenson, thanks so much for being on the Anchored podcast. Love to have you back on again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.